Today is one of many memorable exchanges between Jesus and Peter. Perhaps you remember the time when Jesus called Peter onto the water and he was walking and then all of a sudden he sank like a stone. Or the time that Jesus rebuked him and called him Satan because he wanted to stop Jesus from going to Jerusalem to die. Or do you remember the time when he said, "I will never abandon you"? And Jesus said, "You will." Perhaps you remember the stories of Holy Week when Jesus predicts that Simon Peter will deny him 3 times before the cock crows twice. And in fact, that's what happens. And he weeps bitterly. And then after all the time that Jesus has invested in Peter, teaching him the way of nonviolent love and resistance, what does he do when the soldiers come and arrest Jesus? He takes out the sword. And Jesus rebukes him and says, "Put it away, for those who pick up the sword shall die by the sword." And yet, Peter's also the one who, when he is walking with James and John and Jesus asks, "Who do you say that I am?" He's the one who gets the answer right. He says, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus turns to Peter, who is then Simon, and he says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for you have seen rightly, and for this reason I will call you Peter," which means rock. "And on this rock I will build my church, and I will give to you, Peter, the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And the gates of Hades, of darkness, shall not prevail against you." Peter is a reminder to me, I think to all of us, that in the spiritual life, there are no gifted and talented students. None of us are born gifted and talented. Or maybe we should say all of us are born. But we all are special needs children. We all learn things the hard way. We learn things and we learn to do them right by first doing them wrong. Think about your own life. Think about the people who've made an impact in your life. I suspect the most gracious and forgiving people in your life are those who have stumbled upon their own need for grace, their own need for God's forgiveness and somebody else's. Peter asked Jesus, "Should I forgive 7 times?" And Jesus says, "No. 77, or other translations say 70 times 7, which is a metaphor for the rest of your life." We never stop needing to learn how to forgive. He's saying, in essence, to Peter, forgiveness is not a sprint. It's a marathon. So quit looking for the finish line. You're never going to see it. Just keep being on the way, being on the journey, offering God your willingness to learn how to forgive, to be a student of forgiveness for the rest of your life. Be comfortable being uncomfortable on this journey. Some of you may remember about 6.5 years ago, Dr. Ira Byock came to Westside. We had a joint program with Valley Hospital here in this sanctuary. He became famous from a book that he wrote. He had spent decades in palliative care and the emergency room, and he became an expert on end of life. And he wrote a book called The 4 Things That Matter Most. And these were statements that people need to hear when they're dying and that we need to say to others when they're dying. And they're very simple but powerful statements. Here are the 4 statements. Thank you. I love you. Please forgive me. I forgive you. Now, he would argue in this book, these are not things that we should just say on somebody's deathbed. We should work at saying all of these things during the course of one another's life. The subtitle of that book, 4 Things That Matter Most, is called The Book of Living. We're called to live in this way. And did you notice that half of those statements, 50%, 2 of 4, are about forgiveness? Did you know that the number one topic that Jesus preaches and teaches about is forgiveness? And some argue as much as 2/3 of his teaching, 2/3, are in a direct or indirect way about forgiveness. Something about forgiveness. Not only does Jesus want to impart to Peter, he wants to impart to us. It's as if we can't understand God until we get forgiveness. The God who sent Jesus not to change God's mind about us, but to change our mind about who God is. Richard Rohr, who offered that insight, suggests that forgiveness is the only human action that reveals three goodnesses, three of them at the same time. And when we forgive, he says, we choose the goodness of the other over their faults. We experience God's goodness flowing through us, and we also experience our own goodness in a way that surprises us. So I want to take those one at a time. Number one, when we forgive, we choose the goodness of the other over their faults. Is anybody here today as good as your best success and as bad as your worst failure? Isn't it true of all of us that we're a mixture? We are at the same time saint and sinner. Yes, we're created in the image of a good God, but oftentimes we act in petty, unhelpful, bad ways. I always love that quote from Solzhenitsyn. You know, the line between good and evil does not fall between people or political parties or classes of people, but between each human heart. For each of us have the capacity for good and for evil. I saw South African comedian Trevor Noah on The Late Show recently, and he was talking about his travels around the world. And here is his observation about us, about Americans. I thought it was really insightful. He said, overseas, I find that people spend more time criticizing for the people they vote for, not the people they voted against. Did you hear that? They spend more time criticizing the people that they vote for in an attempt to hold them accountable to the promises that they have made. He said, in America, you do it the opposite. You criticize the other person, the person you didn't vote for, and you let your person off the hook. How crazy is it? But don't we do that? Our team is right. We don't see the flaws in our political party or our team or our religion. We see it in everybody else. That's called immature thinking. And yet, we are captivated in America by that kind of thinking. Do you remember who Jesus was the toughest on? How many think it was the Muslims? It was his fellow Jews. And in particular, it wasn't the little guy. It wasn't the poor. It was the leadership of his tribe. That's who he was toughest with. And he wanted to break the cycle of blaming everybody else. He taught his disciples, who would become the leaders of the church, when you see your fault in your neighbor, don't pick at it. Deal with your massive flaws in yourself, and then you will see fit to be helpful to your neighbor. Too many of us in America are prone to what Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie calls the single story. We say Democrats are fill in the blank. Republicans are fill in the blank. Immigrants are fill in the blank. The poor are, the 1% are, Muslims are, evangelical Christians are, and we come up with a single story. And the single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue. There's always an element of truth in our worst critics' words, but they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. we're dominated, I think, by single story thinking. Instead of seeing clearly the good and the bad in others, we look to confirm the bad that we already believe in them. And then we turn that tendency into a propensity to be offended every time they do something bad, because it's confirmation that they're the bad actor. And if we just get rid of them, then everything will be great. How immature is that way of thinking? So why do we persist in single story thinking? I think because it's easy, it's simple. If they're the problem, then we never have to do our own inner work. We never have to look at ourselves. We constantly believe the solution to our problems is getting rid of them, as opposed to dealing with us. But every time we forgive, we don't do this. We see beyond the fault. We see the goodness beyond the single story. We recognize that they are like us and they are filled with contradictions. They contain multitudes, to quote the poet Walt Whitman. We see the human being beneath the stereotype. We see the many stories beneath the one single story. And ironically, when we see somebody else's humanity, we give them the gift of enough breathing room to deal with their faults, which they have and we have. When we forgive, we choose the goodness of the other over their faults, which leads to the second point. We experience God's goodness flowing through us. And that's the parable today. It's such a beautiful parable. The goodness of God is flowing through this king who forgives this servant a massive amount of debt, more than a year's income. He just forgives like that. And then the servant goes out, and his buddy servant, fellow servant, asks for a day's worth of income to be forgiven, to have patience with him. And he literally chokes him. Isn't that a beautiful image? The flow is stopped. How many of us do that? We stop the flow of God with them. And we have that choice every single day, whether we open ourselves to the goodness of God flowing with us or whether we choke. You've heard me share this perhaps, but it's a favorite story of the two bodies of water in the land where Jesus walked. There's the Sea of Galilee, which is a beautiful lake filled with fish, surrounded by lush foliage. And there's another body of water called the Dead Sea, where 7 million tons of water evaporate every day. And the salt content of the Dead Sea is 10 times greater than the oceans of the world. And in the Dead Sea, you will not see seaweed. You'll see no plants. There's no fish. There's no creeping things of any kind. There's nothing alive in the water and even on the banks. And anything that was alive for a moment is covered with salt and killed immediately, including any fish that somehow get into the Dead Sea. They're dead in an instant. Both the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea are fed by the Jordan River. The same river goes into both of them. Each of them receive fresh water every single day. But one of them is filled with life, and the other is filled with death, barren, lifeless. And the only difference is the Sea of Galilee has an outlet. The Dead Sea doesn't. Water flows into both, but it can't flow out of the Dead Sea. And the same is true for us. If all we do is allow the grace of God into our life, but we choke that goodness and keep it from them, then we no longer can be beautiful and alive and good the way that God has called us to be. And we become salty and toxic, and we destroy everyone and everything in our path, including eventually ourselves. When we forgive, we choose the goodness of others over their faults. We allow the goodness of God to flow through us, and we experience our own goodness in a way that surprises us. As a Christian pastor, I apologize if you did not believe or do not believe that you are inherently good. that you are created good. Too many preachers, too many pastors for too long have told people they're evil. You're good. The Bible teaches us, the first story of creation teaches you that you're blessed by a good God, and you are good. Created by love, for love. This is true of each one of you, all of you, and we should be trumpeting this out for all eternity. This is good news. As Christians, it shouldn't also surprise you that violence of all kinds does not work. If you want to get rid of evil, you don't do something evil. If you want to get rid of hate, you don't use hate. None of it works. As Christians, it ought to be clear that the single story, stereotyped way of thinking, holding grudges, all of this does not get the outcome that we want, that we most deeply need. As Christians, it shouldn't surprise us that when we harden our heart, we cut ourselves off from God's love and from loving others. And it shouldn't surprise us that when we don't forgive people, as Desmond Tutu famously said, we remain chained to the person we can't forgive, bound with chains of bitterness, tied together, trapped with them, while the other person holds the key because we've given it to them for our happiness. In essence, that person becomes our jailer. The Dalai Lama loves to tell this story, and I want to share it, of a Tibetan monk who spent 18 years in Chinese labor camp. And he was speaking with him one day, and the man said that he had faced danger on many occasions. So that made the Dalai Lama curious, and so he asked him, "What danger did you face in that Chinese prison?" And he said, "The danger of losing compassion for the Chinese." When we forgive, we cut out the malignant tumor in our own lives, in our inner life, and we put one foot in front of the other on our way, on that marathon path of learning to be forgiven and forgiving. And here's the thing, none of us ever become the gifted and talented forgiven person. No. We never get the medal. We never arrive. We never see the finish line. And the question is, will you do the next right thing? Will you allow that goodness that wants to flow through you to flow through and stop choking it with your self-righteousness so that you might even be surprised at how merciful and graceful and good you can be? Amen.